China makes up 1/5 of the world's population, 1/5 of the world's economy, and is the leading force in most of the technologies of the future, be they robots, batteries, electric cars. However, Western commentators know extraordinarily little about the country that will shape the 21st century, as demonstrated in this viral clip from French TV.
Qui peut aujourd'hui citer, je vous pose la question à tous, qui peut citer autour de cette table le nom, c'est la question que pose Gilles Gressani, qui peut aujourd'hui citer le nom de 3 Chinois vivants?
Et c'est tout.
Qui peut?
Xi Jinping.
3 Chinois vivants.
3 Chinois vivants, 3 personnes chinoises vivantes.
Et le président
Xi Jinping, oui.
Oui, vous voulez les noms,
c'est déjà
c'est ça
un.
Xi Jinping,
Voilà.
Oui.
vous voyez? Vous voyez?
Non, mais ça dit quelque chose de
Alors,
fondamental.
Ah oui, la vache.
Non, mais je pense que ça dit
Gilles
quelque chose de
Gressani.
fondamental parce
Ça s'appelle le grand sculpteur.
parce qu'en fait, on vit en réalité avec des représentations mentales qui sont celles du XXe siècle, du début du XXe siècle. On vit toujours en 2000 alors qu'on est en fait en réalité beaucoup plus proche à 2050.
C'est pas fou.
Et en 2026, la Chine, c'est la moitié de ce qui compte en géopolitique et en économie. Voilà. Et donc, il y a un problème quand effectivement des personnes cultivées qui s'intéressent aux affaires internationales, qui lisent la presse, au fond, ont du mal à se représenter l'existence de 3 figures chinoises. Donc,
That was France's leading news program, and they were discussing a new book out about geopolitics. And the 2 pundits, so not the author of the book, but the 2 sort of pundits who were there to discuss politics in general, were asked to name 3 Chinese living people, 3 living Chinese people. Now, neither could name 2, right? So they could only name Xi Jinping and no one else, not a single other living Chinese person. Now, reactions to that clip have fallen into 2 camps. So one side says this shows the myopia of Western pundits who lack curiosity about the rest of the world. As I say, they only care about what's going on in the West. They just sort of talk about China as if it's this bad place and don't learn anything about it. Now, that's not implausible. I think that's entirely possible. The other side suggests that it speaks to a failure of the Chinese state. So the argument goes that control of culture by the party means the Chinese have failed to generate films, TV, music, books with proper international appeal, and they're thereby lost out in terms of soft power. Now, it's also the case that in the political realm, without competitive elections, fewer politicians get recognition in the international sphere. So if you to ask someone, name 3 Americans, they might name 3 presidents who are living. Xi Jinping, obviously been in power for 15 years. There wasn't an election. You don't know who the losing candidate was. Now, personally, I think it's a bit from column A and a bit from column B. I don't think we really need to argue about that. I wanted to do something slightly different with this section because whatever the explanation, it doesn't seem ideal. So to help you, if you ever find yourself on a news panel and you're required to name 3 living Chinese people, we're going to do a profile of 3 living Chinese people who I thought might be of interest to Novara media viewers. Well, sorry, we're going to begin with Jack Ma. This is, I think, China's most famous businessman on the international stage. I was surprised I didn't manage to mention him, to be honest. One of the most famous Chinese people in the world. Founder of Alibaba Group, which is an e-commerce company, completely ubiquitous in China. Everyone in the country will have Alipay on their phone, which is a payment app. Ma has a rags to riches story. So he came from humble origins, failed his university entrance exams twice, was rejected from jobs at KFC. In his mid-30s, he was an English teacher, earning the equivalent of $12 a month. But after a trip to the US in the 1990s and his first encounter with the internet, he formulated a plan to build an e-payment system to link up Chinese producers with buyers in the West. He saw a gap in the market and he decided to fill it. Now, this is a legendary clip that I'm going to show you. He's giving an investment pitch to friends before the 1999 Alibaba IPO.
华业所要瞄准的对象不是国内战略，而是国际战略。我们所有的竞争对手不在于中国，而在于美国的硅谷。第二个呢，我想就是我们要学会硅谷人的一种拼劲。如果说我们是早上8点钟下班，8点钟上班，5点钟下班，这个不是搞高科技。这个绝对不是我们阿里巴巴能成功。如果是我们有这种精神，反正我上班了，那个8点钟上班，5点钟下班了 ，OK， 赶紧去其他地方。人家美国人强就强他的硬件，强就强他的系统建设，这方面确实比你糟。但是玩信息玩软的，中国人的脑袋绝不比人差。我们在座的所有的人的脑袋绝不比任何人差。这就是我们敢跟美国人斗的结果。
It's amazing. Just like kind of looks like a home video of him pitching a company to some friends. He ends up being worth about $27 billion. Because compete with the Americans, Jack Ma did. His company was central in building a base for Chinese tech that had independence from Silicon Valley. So he said, we can compete with Silicon Valley. We can build our own companies. They did, something we haven't managed very well in the UK. So they don't use American payment systems in China. They use their own payment systems. We use the American ones. Jack Ma was also famous for being an irreverent character. So at Alibaba's 18th birthday celebrations, he performed as Michael Jackson to 40,000 assembled employees. However, he dropped from public view in 2020 after he criticized the Chinese government for being too risk-averse when it came to financial regulation. This was also amid China's crackdown on big tech, which the government judged was running out of its control. The government then cancelled an IPO of his fintech firm, Ant Financial. And Jack Ma moved to Tokyo to lecture on sustainable farming. Really interesting guy. Jack Ma now, though, appears to be back in the government's good books. He returned to China in 2023 after being persuaded by China's premier, Li Qiang. He was pitched at an event with Xi Jinping last year. So that's character number one, embodies China's capitalist dynamism. Also, it's entrepreneurs taking inspiration from the West and saying we can do it even better ourselves. Also a story of how China, unlike the West, has a state which can click its finger and, I suppose, bring its power to bear on tech executives, however rich they might be. I should say, with not very much accountability. We shouldn't sort of say this is brilliant and yes, we should also do the same, but interesting nonetheless. This is Wang Huning, who I'm not surprised the French pundits didn't mention. He's not at all famous in the West. In China, though, his significance can't really be overstated. Wang has been the leading ideologist in the Communist Party since the 1980s. A former academic, he's advised the last 3 Communist Party leaders. Since 2017, he sits on the 7-member Politburo Standing Committee. So that's the most powerful body in the country. They're the ones who make sort of the final decisions. He's the 4th or 5th ranking member of that standing committee. He's a proponent of what was known as neo-authoritarianism. So the idea that a nation as big and poor as China needed a firm hand to push through modernization before it could consider becoming a democracy. He was inspired by other Asian countries like South Korea and especially Singapore. In a 1995 interview, he said this. So he says, in a place without central authority or a place where central authority has become weakened, the country would be mired in a state of division and chaos. A strong central authority is the fundamental guarantee for achieving rapid and stable development at a relatively low cost during the process of modernization. 4 years before he gave that comment, in 1991, 1991, he visited the United States and wrote his observations in a book called America Against America. It was a book which celebrated America's technological progress compared to China, but also highlighted the contradictions he saw in the system, which he thought made the entire system vulnerable. And this really came back into prominence after the Capitol riots in 2021, so when it did look like American democracy was collapsing. This is part of a review from former analyst at the Rand Corporation, David Ronfeld, of that book, America Against America. He says, a key theme is that American society, while offering much to admire, is so fraught with individualism, so lacking in spiritual community and cultural security, its youth too ignorant of traditional Western values, too prone to nihilism, that American democracy risks decaying into a war with itself, hence the title. Given its excessive individualism, Chinese collectivism will surely prove the superior way to go. Reading America's major conservative thinkers back then, notably Alan Bloom and Charles Moynihan, heavily influenced Wang's views about America. Today, they seem prophetic, and they persist in shaping China's strategy towards the US, perhaps for years to come, if Xi extends his stay in power with Wang alongside as ideological leader of the new authoritarians. Now, the reason I'm reading you a review of the book instead of the book is, I have to admit, I haven't yet read the book. I'll put it on my reading list. Sounds very, very interesting. I think why this guy is very interesting, because we know Xi Jinping, we know the political leaders. We discuss sort of the ideology of China less. And I think what this sort of puts forward is the extent to which people understate the social conservatism of other countries, and also sort of the nationalism. Because I think often when people in the UK sort of talk about Western values, yada, yada, we assume they're sort of like far-right xenophobes. There are lots of sort of countries in the developing world where the political leaders come here and they say, you guys really need to love your country a bit more. You need some kind of national culture, because otherwise the whole thing is going to fall apart. There's something sort of particular about societies like Britain, where it's sort of high status to say the country's rubbish and we don't have anything that we have in common. And then the Chinese come over and say, you guys need a myth to organize around. I don't know if this is going to work. Finally, but definitely not least, we have Tu Youyou. She's amazing. She's a Nobel Prize winning Chinese malariologist and pharmaceutical chemist. She's currently 95 years old. And as I say, amazing story. In 1967, during the Vietnam War, Ho Chi Minh, so obviously the leader of North Vietnam, requested China's help in developing an anti-malaria drug. This was because malaria was affecting Vietnamese soldiers on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so obviously the northern Vietnamese soldiers. The type of malaria predominant in southern Vietnam was resistant to chloroquine, which is what's widely used for malaria treatment outside of Southeast Asia. Tu Youyou was asked to head up the team to develop the treatment. And this is what's really interesting. She turned to the insights of traditional Chinese medicine. So this is from her Wikipedia. No shame in quoting from Wikipedia, because it's the best website on the internet. Scientists worldwide had screened over 240,000 compounds without success. In 1969, Tu, then 39 years old, had an idea of screening Chinese herbs. She first investigated the Chinese medical classics in history, visiting practitioners of traditional Chinese medicine all over the country on her own. She gathered her findings in a notebook called A Collection of Single Practical Prescriptions for Anti-Malaria. Her notebook summarized 640 prescriptions. By 1971, her team had screened over 2,000 traditional Chinese recipes and made 380 herbal extracts from some 200 herbs, which were tested on mice. She's gone back through ancient Chinese sort of recipes and tested them. Then she finds that one compound was particularly effective, sweet wormwood, which was used for intermittent fevers, sort of in ancient Chinese medicine, which is a hallmark of malaria. As Tu also presented the project at this project seminar, its preparation was described in a recipe from 1,600-year-old traditional Chinese herbal medicine text, Emergency Prescriptions, kept up one's sleeve. In 1972, she and her colleagues obtained the pure substance and named it Qinghasu, or Artemisinin in English. This substance has now saved millions of lives, especially in the developing world. So this is really, really cool. She's tasked with this sort of in the middle of the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese, the Vietnamese communists are getting malaria. They need a specific malaria drug, which is to this sort of chloroquine-resistant strain. She says, Western scientists have gone through so many compounds and none of it seems to work. Let's go to ancient Chinese wisdom, but then apply the techniques of Western medicine to it. She gets something, she wins the Nobel Prize. After saving millions of lives, obviously saving millions of lives, more important than winning the Nobel Prize. But when she did win that prize in 2015, ITV included this clip in a news report about it.
This demonstrates we have a precious wealth from our ancient time, she said after winning the award. Just as the late Chairman Mao said, traditional Chinese medicine is a treasure vault.
So, three famous living Chinese people. I don't want to just be on here saying, oh, those pundits are so dumb. If there is a problem in society, instead of complaining, we should try and solve it. So if there are too many pundits that can't name free living Chinese people, send them this clip. Banseka.
Yeah, I feel very well educated, actually. That was a nice bit of an introduction to...
That's what I'm trying to do with these shows, less heat, more light.
Yeah, very good. Counter the instincts that social media embeds in us as journalists.
Do you think it matters that you have pundits that can't name free living Chinese people?
I think it does. I mean, there's two stories here, right? Of course, one of it is a kind of hubris inbuilt into any empire, and there's a hubris there in sort of Western countries where our culture is kind of reigned as dominant, and there's a lack of curiosity. There's certainly a lack of curiosity about what China's doing economically. Tony Blair, for example, when he was talking about China's emissions earlier in his statement this week, he actually admitted how well they were doing on green technology, for example. So there's a bit of mythologizing and sometimes warping. So that's part of the story. But I also do think there is something here to say about the way in which China probably hasn't done kind of cultural hegemony yet, ... could be coming. Maybe some of that stuff is happening already and we don't know it. There was the China maxing stuff, wasn't there, at the start of the year? The dominance of TikTok. I'm wondering if there's a generational angle to this. Those newsreaders were a bit older. I wonder what younger people's exposure perhaps potentially to sort of Chinese culture is. Maybe it's not through individuals, but perhaps culture is omnipresent, isn't it? It's anything and everything.
So my understanding, and I might be wrong, this is very unscientific. My understanding, China's soft power in a way is increasing over the past year or so, but it's not really about celebrities or cultural production. It's about technology, infrastructure, and then also habits and sort of cultural norms. So, when people say I'm at a very Chinese stage in my life and they're drinking warm water because that's what people do in China because they think it's healthier,
right.
Which I believe that actually. I think ancient Chinese medicine is pretty cool. So I think there are lots of people looking at China thinking it's pretty cool. The infrastructure is amazing. The technology is cheap and, we're all using it. And, some of these traditions are pretty cool that they have. But one thing they haven't produced, which obviously the Americans did at this sort of stage of their development, was produced a bunch of celebrities, produced a bunch of really interesting cultural output. And this is what people who are Chinese and China watchers say. I don't think this is an ignorant thing to say from the outside.
No.
But Chinese cinema, people really complain about it.
Right.
Intellectual people who are sort of China watchers say the films are crap. And it is because the censorship means that you can't be particularly sort of creative. And they're the kind of lowest common denominator. It all has to tell a story about how great a nation China is to some degree, or not explicitly, but sort of have an undertone of the kind of message that the party wants to propound, which is quite sort of socially conservative, nationalistic, and doesn't necessarily lead to the most interesting films that everyone in the world wants to watch.
And I think it's fair to say Xi Jinping's approach has maybe got shades more of authoritarianism within it compared to some of his predecessors, pardon me. So, they're probably very wary of individuals, something becoming bigger, holding more influence than Xi, and Xi is synonymous with the CCP, right? That they're talked about as one and the same. And the kind of individualism which lends itself so well to US capitalism, it doesn't quite translate, I think, because of some of these differing values. Got to remember as well, it's fair to say, the US doesn't become as ubiquitous culturally, right from the start. It doesn't really get there maybe till the sort of mid 20th century. I was telling you earlier that I was thinking a lot about Marilyn Monroe, who would have been 100 next week. I was thinking about her as this kind of symbol of American mythology, that sort of mid 20th century emblem of American and Americana. And Marilyn Monroe is she's not really a person per se. She's an idea, and she's a very consciously put together idea. She was built on the conveyor belt of Hollywood. She is someone who is kind of made. She's not organic, right? So it would be interesting to think about, maybe ultimately we're looking at this from a Western lens where we're talking about, well, cultural hegemony means individuals, but actually maybe it doesn't. And maybe actually that the culture and values of China politically will actually just suit a different kind of political hegemony. I also think as well, just really quickly, some of it is also language.
Yeah.
So in the US, for example, they had the benefit already of the British Empire, which had already gone around spreading the English language everywhere. And so it's much easier to translate ideas and effectively propaganda. My dad, and Congo's not English speaking actually, but my dad essentially got a whole load of American propaganda when he went to school. We went to a boarding school run by Americans in Congo where they all spoke English. And that was a very, useful conduit to project certain ideas about America that he then didn't find out till he left Congo, until he met my mum. Some of the, activities of the CIA and things like that. So language, I think, is also a big part of it. And that may change, of course, as potentially Chinese languages become more part of the ubiquitous culture. So later phases may mean that their cultural dominance does look more hegemonic. Last thing I'll say really quickly as well is that maybe hegemonic cultures worldwide are just over. If we're moving into a multipolar world, maybe that, different will have these kind of three spheres across the world, and China will be hegemonic in its sphere, but maybe it won't be hegemonic elsewhere. So we don't have that kind of all-encompassing cultural hegemony.
So we might have American movies, Chinese tech, Russian oil, I suppose, and European What's Europe produce at the moment? Books, Irish literature, everyone loves.
Oh, I wouldn't
I
mind
say that
that.
because my boyfriend's an Irish novelist, but it's true. People really do like Irish literature at the moment.
They do.
Football. Europe has football.
Yes, we do.
And loads of other stuff. People like European history, the Renaissance, all of that. Everyone's got something to offer, haven't they? On the language point, I 100% agree with you. It's relevant. The counterpoint people would put forward is Japanese manga and Korean K-pop.
Right.
So obviously the languages are equally sort of indecipherable to a Western ear.
Yeah.
And they still have managed to have some quite sort of successful exports.
I think because they don't have those same ties to this very kind of strong sense of collectivism, lack of
Well, they
individualism.
don't have the same censorship as you have in China.
Exactly. And really storytelling is about individuals, really. Like it's, you know, it's about interesting characters, interesting people, interesting stories. That's what music and culture, you know, in those respects is. So those things lend themselves, I think, really well. So I can understand how they're able to transcend the language barrier through those things. Maybe China should look at, you know, exploring cinema, you know, let those barriers down, let people create things a bit.
They did. There's sixth generation Chinese cinema, which is very, very interesting. So Long My Son is actually my favorite movie ever made. It's Chinese.
Ever, period.
I mean, it changed throughout my life, but at the moment, it's the one that I say, you know, because it's the one that's sort of most in my mind.
Okay.
3 hours long, amazing.
I'll put it on my letterbox.
And a couple throughout their life, throughout sort of Chinese development over the past 30 years. So you see that in the background, but with lots of like heartfelt trauma, like the love of parents. And I don't want to give anything away, but you must watch it. There is some brilliant Chinese cinema, but apparently that was before Xi Jinping kind of fucked it all up.
Right.
So the cinema has got less interesting since that.
You can't have
was
everything.
Made.
China can't be good at everything.
True. Yeah. Maybe they should keep the censorship in place so we can continue with this
We
sort
gotta
of
have something, man.
exportable cinema.